Welcome to Legacy Builders, strategies for building successful family enterprises. Brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. I'm your host, Corey Gagnon, Senior Wealth Advisor. And on this show, we explore global ideas, concepts, and models that help family enterprises better navigate the complexities of family wealth. Today, we welcome Sharon Gray, founder and partner at RDT Valuations Group, Inc. With over 35 years of experience navigating the complex financial landscapes of diverse organizations and industries, Sharon excels at analyzing and simplifying intricate business and financial situations. Sharon is a chartered professional accountant and holds the Certified Business Valuator and Family Enterprise Advisor designations. Harnessing her sharp analytical skills and innovative problem-solving approach, Sharon's pioneering work has enabled clients to make solid, well-founded, and proactive decisions with confidence, fostering understanding and collaboration among all parties involved in the process. My goal is to be the most curious person in today's conversation with Sharon Gray, where we explore the complexities of family business valuation and the importance of proactive planning. Sharon emphasizes the need for a cohesive plan that balances personal financial needs with business investment and the challenges of transitioning ownership between generations. We'll also highlight the significance of understanding value drivers, managing expectations, and making informed decisions to ensure the long-term success of family enterprise. Now, let's dive in. Welcome, Sharon. We're excited to have you today to share your wealth knowledge and experiences with us. Let's dive in, shall we?
Thank you, Corey. Happy to be here.
Sharon, imagine you're delivering the commencement speech to the graduating class of 2024, and you have the chance to inspire them with your story. How would you begin your speech to convey the incredible lessons and experiences that you've gained along your career?
That's a heavy-weighted conversation to start. I think like anyone who reaches a certain age and stage in their life, they reflect back on all the decisions they made along the way and realize that a lot of things happen out of happenstance, and a lot of hard work and energy is spent trying to perfect the plan. And I think that we would all realize later that many things go off the rails along the way, and all we can do is do our best at that time. But it also gives you some reflection that most things aren't life-altering. And especially in the business category, many things can go wrong, many things do go wrong, many things certainly don't go as planned. But most often, those are blips along a longer journey. And the ability for business owner and business families to navigate some of these impactful moments, for good and bad, is what defines a legacy. And one of the most descriptive slides when I took my Family Enterprise Advisor program for me was a continuum. It was just a flat line, and with birth on one end and on the left, death. The description was about the longevity of families, and also during the course of a lifetime, a legacy, a family succession, there will be blips within that line. You know, there will be deaths, there'll be divorces, there will be probably bad decision making, there will be people that come and go in the business. And the true legacy of the ability to weather that is to recognize that those things, I think, are going to happen, and to plan the best you can around the fact that they will happen. Let's get some process and structures in place to allow us to weather those situations in a lot more proactive way, other than just being reactive when they do happen.
There's so much to dive into there, Sharon, and I'm very excited. So you mentioned about the perfect plan. Going back to that sense of need to make something perfect. How in your career, in your lifetime, have you seen that work and maybe not work for people or yourself?
Well, I think as individuals, we all think we're doing the right thing. We all, independent of everyone outside of us, believe that the decisions we're making, the plan that we view for our kids and our families and our companies are all the right things for many, many reasons. We're the person that is the driving force behind them. Perhaps our kids aren't ready for transition. Perhaps time and conditions suggest that, you got to put hard work in. But sometimes that's not the right thing to do. We kind of have to give away or give up before we really need to give up. And by that, I mean you have to transition earlier than you probably think you need to transition. You need to bring people in place in advance of when you possibly need them, feet on the ground. You need to bring up people with a longer runway. So you're not just dropping people into the middle of a situation that is too gnarly to kind of unwind themselves. It's about recognizing that, when you think about families, that it is a bit of some person gaining and some person giving.
Right. And so if we kind of go back to that process and the giving before you feel ready, does that translate to the processes that allow the business and the family and the enterprise itself to be able to weather the storm? Is that as you were getting at?
Yeah, I think we all have to be proactive. And with proactive, firstly, you feel more in control. Much of people's stress is that they don't spend enough time planning. So when things do go off the rails or when issues happen, it's now, you're in emergent mode and you don't know how you're going to unwrap yourselves and move forward. So thinking through some of processes to transition, perhaps it's not today, perhaps it's 5 years from now, allow you with some reflective time and maybe put in place some of the things you should be putting in place before you actually transition it. I'm a finance person, and I've worked on many situations where often the builder of the business, they're not ready to sell the business or to transition it. And so they have their children come in and work very hard and diligently. And as they're working very hard and diligently, the father is, often the father spending less and less time there. And there has been no formal transition of ownership. So what's really happened from a financial perspective is the kids are bringing wealth to the business. They're actually contributing to its growth, its prosperity. Then you do a transaction where the ownership changes and the kids will have to pay for their effort. So it's, and there can be very challenging conversations when there's been that shifting of impact, but not a coinciding shifting of power or ownership. And that does have an impact on the family dynamic.
Right. And so if you were to say, the paying for their efforts, and I love that going into that discussion, Sharon, is people realize it when it's too late. And how can they proactively, maybe get ahead of this where they're thinking about it, or maybe their advisors are bringing it up to them so that they don't get to that point where you get involved and they realize, wow, we've created a bit of an issue here. Mm-hmm.
People do create a bit of an issue, especially when they own businesses, because it's a constant fight between paying yourself personally and investing in the company. And so I think in the terms of the financial side, which is often a driver of when you transition, people have to feel ready financially, is you need to have a more cohesive plan between business and how those profits that it's generating and how its expansion and how its financial aspects to it are impacting you personally. Because often the builder is the person who takes great pride in the expansion of the company. They've done it from the grassroots up, and the number of trucks on the road is what brings them great pride.
Yep.
And but in doing so, they've starved the other side of their equation, which is their personal financial situation. So the only thing that they have is the company, which becomes more and more profitable and bigger. And for the second generation, that becomes a minefield to try to figure out the best way to pay the builder while not starving the second generation because of the price that
Right.
it's going to cost, right? There's a value proposition there. And you have to get one person out before the other person gets to take it as their own.
Well, and Sharon, how do you tell the builder to stop investing?
Well, I don't necessarily think it's stopping investing. I think it's being cognizant of, for the builder, maybe they don't get value all at once. Maybe it's going to have to take time for them to extract whatever it's worth when they change ownership. It's not just going to happen with a check landing. But it also has to not starve the buyer, because I've seen transactions that were sort of negotiated amongst the owners, one getting out and one buying in, and they haven't done any diligence over the values per se. And, in some circumstances, exiting shareholders expecting that the buyer pay for 10 years worth of profits over 10 years. Well, if that's what they're doing, imagine that. Every dollar that person's making for the next 10 years is going back to the original owner. And that's not a good investment.
Right.
Not unless you're maybe Amazon or something like that. So it takes some planning. There's lots of businesses, just as business exists, is complex. Just running a little store is complex. You add on families, you add on financial. For most family structures who own businesses, everyone's reliant on that business for living. And where you see a lot of challenges is where the personal financial situations of the individuals around the table are varying. Some people need more money, some people need less money. Some people are in blended families. Like, the complexity only grows the more people in the ecosystem. And it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah. Let's go back to the comment of starving the buyer. To me, that really means expectations. What is the expectations of all the parties at play? And how have you seen maybe unrealistic expectations in your world when you come into saying, okay, now we need a valuation, be it one of probably their advisors said, we actually need this to be somebody else to give us a valuation, and expectations on one end of the continuum are here and then somebody else there. How do you see those showing up?
Well, if you've got a person that's actively working in the business, then, the language is common. They know profitability. They understand what makes the business valuable, what drives value, whose efforts are important. So in terms of that, they have a common ground. Where it becomes challenging is that if often in smaller businesses, people aren't paid properly for their, either they're paid too much or too little for their involvement, and you need to get the compensation rate. And then you need to get the ownership value properly accounted for. Because when you do a business valuation, one of the main adjustments in looking at profitability is in those owner salaries. What is fair market value? Because before you buy, you pay dime one for the value of shares, you're going to want to be paid for the time and effort you put in to generate profits. So it's really important that in doing that math, that people first get paid for what they contribute in a fair way. And over and above that becomes the quantum of business value. And when you're dealing with people who, again, when you have one person who is used to earning a lot of money and then may not be able to do that on an ongoing basis, or there's no extra profits for the company,
right?
There's layers of all these issues. I also find that often when people negotiate between, say, one sibling's interested in the business and maybe three aren't or two aren't, it's really important, I think, for the other three or the other two siblings who are outside the business to understand that there's enough due diligence done on the transaction itself so that they never feel like the firstborn got a win.
Right.
There has to be some recognition that there may only be one new owner, but there's other people within the system that need some feedback on the process, the plan, the execution.
Now, in your world, Sharon, where you're doing evaluation and we're talking about siblings, oftentimes, and farming is a good example, where what's fair isn't equal and what's equal isn't fair. Now, when it comes to evaluation, you don't put any of that into your valuation. It's here's what the business is worth. Now it's up to the family of how do you create fairness or how do you equalize? Where do you see some of those struggles come in?
Well, I worked on a file a number of years ago, which was such a learning file for me because there were 5 children. Dad had died. Mom was still there. And they owned a very successful private business. They had real estate, which was in a separate company, and they had an operating business. The boys were gifted on the transition, the operating company, and the girls were going to. Mom hadn't died yet, so it was promised that the girls would get the real estate, and in that way it would be equal.
Right.
The challenge, however, was, as you could potentially expect, the boys got the operating business early, and the girls had to sit and potentially wait for their share. Not only did you have that as sort of a problem, because that's a real problem.
Yep.
But you also had the operating company needed to use the buildings as security for the operations.
Okay.
So you had a lot of challenges with how do you navigate that and all the emotional aspects of the girls.
Yep.
The parents were really trying to be fair. They had their best intent. Many people. And for parents, they felt strongly that that was the best thing to allow the legacy business, the operating business, to continue with some of these other assets in place. But for the few years from transition of the operating company forward, it was a real challenge for the girls because they didn't have rights to those buildings. They couldn't say no to the mortgages that were placed on it or the equity drawdowns that were made.
Right. And that complexity of the family enterprise, where it's not just there's one business, there's multiple different types of assets, is really the complexity that we deal with. And so in those cases, again, going to expectations, where somebody comes up with the best intention, and this goes back to one of the comments you made as we started about those bumps in the road. So, going to the death, divorce, and bad decisions, how does that play in? Again, best intentions, but maybe a bad decision. How do we bring that into family enterprise and valuation?
Well, I think people have a hard time being challenged and really listening. It's the what ifs that always derail the process, right? My background is I've spent over 30 years looking at probably 50 to 80 businesses a year. And I can tell you that probably of all the negative files I've worked on, and by that I mean active litigation work, shareholder disputes, estates gone wrong, things like that, that if people had perhaps not been driven by one thing. There's always one magic thing that's pushing someone to transact often. Often it's, a tax-driven motive or, got to get these shares in someone's hands and worry about the details later. But if they really spent some time sitting back and thinking about the bigger ecosystem and how is this all going to work and what's this going to mean over here in the case I just mentioned to the girls' legacy, what's that going to mean? Can these two entities be unbundled, so to speak? When's mom going to give the girls their share?
Right.
These are things that need to be talked about. But when I sat in on the final meeting and, you had lawyers and accountants and the family and the matriarch, the mother there was definite red flags going off in my head, because it was like, this will not end well. I don't know when, I don't know how, but there's too much undecided, unplanned, unthought out consequences to this intermingling of these two businesses and these sort of set aside future distributions to the girls that really haven't been dealt with, right? And personalities get in the way. I mean, and so there's lots of emotional, just how we all are in the bigger world aspects to these matters.
Right. Now, going back to the motivations behind actions, and you mentioned tax-driven decisions. It can be from an estate perspective. Oftentimes, they'll act first and pick up the pieces later. What are some of the consequences to some of those examples that you were giving there?
There's always another great tax plan.
Yes.
We all know that. Taxes drive a lot of decisions. My experience has been that what you do for one purpose be used at some point along the way for a completely different purpose, and potentially with a different, where you wanted a high number to start, you now need a low number. You're still expecting a low number. One of the very first assignments I worked on in Vancouver actually is probably a great lens into this. A lawyer had crystallized his one-person law firm using back then the $500,000 capital gain exemption. So he went to an accountant, did the crystallization, had a freeze, $500,000 tax-free. He effectively withdrew from his little PC. And 2 years later, his wife came in. I worked for Deloitte back then. And his wife came in and they were going through divorce. And so she comes in and she says, "What's the value of my sole practitioner's law practice?" The theory of valuation is it has to be saleable, and a one-person law practice likely wouldn't have too much value outside of the person. So we said, listen, it probably won't be worth very much, but you go argue hard on that $500,000 crystallized value that he himself came up with at the time he did his tax transaction. So she went before the court, and with her lawyer, the judge, of course, said to the fellow, you either refile CRA and tell them your value is zero, or you pay your wife $250,000, half of the $500,000. He got out his checkbook. You can't argue with something you've done.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
Very hard.
Yes.
So the lesson is, of course, whatever you've done for one purpose will, for lack of a better phrase, bite you in the butt the next time.
Let's talk about he himself came up with that valuation and how often we see that where it might be for lack of understanding. Could be that somebody was trying to avoid some professional fees and they decided, oh, here, I can come up with a valuation. What are the consequences of that?
Well, I just worked on a file a few years ago, which was quite an interesting file because there was a lot of complexity, but a lawyer had come up with this new design for sort of transferring goodwill. He had used an online valuation program to come up with this value for goodwill. The CRA came back and said for this little piece of this transaction, which did have tax consequence to him, they came back and reassessed him on these numbers. And this online program was coming up with these outrageous valuation numbers because when you put 3 bad assumptions into an online calculator, it's going to come up with wrong numbers, right? So he asked us to go through and basically do valuations of all these 5 or 6 entities that he had this proposed transaction. And ultimately, it cost him $100,000 in fees to fight the CRA. But the CRA, it's on the taxpayers' onus to prove. So if CRA comes knocking on the door and they're asking you to validate a transaction that you've done, you have to prove your position. And what we often find is that because people do things, 3 years ago, they do things perhaps for a very valid reason at the time, but they don't paper it properly. So they forget why they thought the way they did, where even the Excel file is that they had done their calculations with. It's just people change, memories fade. What was appropriate in one case may not be appropriate in another. So you do get wrong numbers out there all the time. And when and if CRA were to assess you, the till just starts ringing for the tax lawyers and the accountants and the valuators to try to help you support or come up with the proper position. It's just not worth shortchanging on the initial transaction. It really isn't.
Yep.
Costs too much money.
And so in those situations, as you said, going back is very difficult. Drawing back to a previous discussion, as mentioned that the people actively involved in the business know their business extremely well. And there are these online tools or these, call it shortcuts out there. And, call it the country club effect of, oh, I've got a multiple and I know, it's a multiple of what? Well, what's your valuation? Oh, it's 7 times. Well, 7 times what? And so how can people who believe that they're savvy, how do they check those biases and make sure that it's okay? Or no, and it might be a valuation that they don't need for a transaction or for tax purposes. It might just be that they're looking to see, are we driving value in this enterprise? How do they check that? What do they do other than call you?
Well, they call me to start because then you at least maybe you have some into how a buyer might look at you, right? So, there's value, there's other assets that exist, redundant cash, redundant assets. What kind of working capital would a buyer expect to take if they were to acquire you? What's the multiple? What's the right debt level? There's a reason that the CBV, which is a chartered business valuator, it requires 3 years of study, a national exam, and so many hours of work. It's not on the back of a Kellogg's box. Even if you wanted a gut check for an experienced valuator, who can educate you on the process, how people might look at you, what are the value drivers, what is extracting or removing value. It's worth a lesson.
Yeah. And so let's talk about that as it relates to business strategy, because you talked about, the undecided, the unplanned, the things that come and bite you. And so understanding those value drivers and understanding what a buyer would be looking for can also mean that you're running a healthier business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people often thought they need to just organize themselves to sell. But the reality is, why are you not organizing yourself now and higher profits because you've made some more insightful decisions, right? A couple sort of high level things I'd say if you're, thinking about an acquisition is often what people might do is they might buy new equipment. And so they buy that equipment over say they're trying to sell today and they've spent the last year acquiring new pieces of equipment. Well, it's really hard if your cash flows haven't monetized the implementation of that new equipment. Your cash flows are still, last year's cash flows reflect, lesser equipment. It's hard to sell the buyer on, I'm going to be so much busier. I've got these 3 new backhoes and they're going to add so much more value. So, you have to be mindful that if you're strategically expanding, then you need to do so in advance of your exit or take something on the back end of the deal to allow for you to capture value in some aspect. The other thing that is very important and worth mentioning for sure is working capital, because lots of private companies, particularly those that are very financially prudent, often spend less time on working capital, which is really, accounts receivable, inventory, less payables, in the simple math. And so they may not collect their receivables as quickly as they need to. They don't, They extend their customers good credit. Payables, they pay right away, though. They're the ones that, want to get the payables off their books. They're running probably at a very high working capital. So they have maybe 2.5 or 3 times payables to their payables. Well, that's not what the industry out there might need. They might need 1.5 times, not 3 times. And
Yep.
What that translates to when you're doing a transaction is if you don't need that excess working capital sitting there, you should get paid for it, right? So there's an extra value that a person who is running a 3-to-1 company should get compared to someone who's running at 1.5 times working capital. And working capital is always one of those throwaway points when you initially have a letter of intent signed, which is basically we'll pay you X and working capital's to be decided later. And I would always advise, no, I want to know the whole deal.
Yep.
I want to know the whole situation today, not 3 months later after you've done your due diligence. Because it can be millions and millions of dollars to business owners.
Yep, absolutely. And so if we go back to the knowing value drivers is good strategy, let's talk about the kids paying for their efforts. Because maybe that rising gen comes in and, maybe mom and dad have stepped back a bit and they say, we want to implement strategy. And hey, Sharon, can you come in and give us a bit of an idea of these value drivers? And maybe we're doing some contingency planning and making sure that we're taking the right risks here. But then they have to pay for it because they haven't. So in a family transaction like that, where maybe we're not talking about an outside buyer, maybe working capital is a little blurrier because that transaction isn't as cut and dry. How would you, give that advice to a family who maybe the kids are just starting out, maybe they're working their way through, maybe they've got a profit center that they're in control of right now, and they're looking at maybe executive position next, and now it's becoming closer to we need to get started or get a plan in place. How would you advise on that one?
Well, I think ultimately the goal is to generate returns, right? And you're making decisions based on where you feel you can get higher value adds, right? And when you're looking at something as simple as working capital, it doesn't mean you're going to change your process or policies, but it might mean that you change them 3 years before you sell, right? So it's all about education, It's about appreciating where you add value and where you detract value. And sometimes that's okay. Lots of businesses, they should go big. It's about expansion and it's about growth, and you always have to be on that trajectory. And there are many smaller operations that are incredibly profitable with probably less stress because you're not trying to continually move, and higher means better or bigger means better. And that's okay. Because if you reach a level of profitability, that may be just enough, which wasn't the fellow who built Vanguard said the biggest answer to a question is how much do you need, right? And it's enough. It might be just fine for what you want to accomplish and what you want your financial life to look like.
Yeah. Well, Sharon, as we near the end of our conversation today, there's a few questions that I ask each guest before we wrap up. Are you ready for the tough ones?
Okay. I'm sitting down. So
Awesome. Well, the first is, what is one key strategy you believe is most essential for building a successful family enterprise?
Communication.
Communication. And can you expand a little bit on that one?
Well, I think that we often hear what we want to hear, and we also have bad memories as people. So I think that communicating about things that you're thinking, you're contemplating, what would it look like, spitballing a lot of things, immersing people in the business or the discussion and not withholding. As parents, I have two older kids. And I'll tell you, there's a fine line between giving them access to everything and trying to create good, what you envision you need to create good people. And there's this tug of war between, I show them everything or do I just let them see a little bit?
Right.
Those are all personally, for all of us, they're challenging. But I think communication is so vital to just people sharing who they are and sharing what their vision is and sharing what they believe and having this common grounding amongst especially your family. But also when you're making these bigger decisions, why you made the decision you did. Because if you have three siblings and they're all offered the same opportunity and one person says, no, I'm out.
Yep.
And then the opportunity that presented itself turns out to be Amazon, they'll be kicking themselves for a lot of years, but they'll forget that they made the decision to not be a part of that for whatever reasons at the time.
Right.
So it's documenting some of the reasons you do things, but also some of the reasons that other decisions were made.
Yep. Great. And what is the most common challenge that you see family enterprises encountering when it comes to wealth transition and generational continuity?
Communication.
Yeah. All right. And do you have maybe another strategy, something to overcome that?
To sort of bridge those conversations, that they have independent people on board, people who can hear the question differently, people who can watch the room, differently, people who may be able to provide a mentoring to the individuals who are coming into their own. The dynamics of always being in that family unit are really, really hard. We remember kids as they were, not who they become. And, siblings, same thing, right? It's hard to unwind that.
Yep. That.
Oh, and on that point, because you and I were talking beforehand, but one of my big lessons during the whole Family Enterprise Advisor, which I think would be very important for families, is we all had to go through a Discovery Insights, which is really like a personality test. But it was so interesting for me to see how people were coded into sort of their natural behavior, and how those people sort of charged ahead or sat back and were reflective, or other people were more socially aware. They wanted a team, environment. At least for me, I found it very insightful to really be aware of who we are and how we are and who they are and how they are. Because we all need different modes of communication and time to reflect and, analytical. Some people don't like numbers at all, and other people like nothing but numbers.
Yep.
So.
And in those family units, they might look at something as a weakness, and in fact, they might be that person's greatest strength.
Yeah, and I'll tell you personally that my husband took this program, the FEA, before I took it. And so after I took my Discovery Insights, and you get the little breakdown of who you are, and you get a summary of sort of your key values, made sense of my life, my married life, because we kind of think we're all the same.
Yeah.
And we're just so totally different.
Absolutely.
And that's a good thing.
It is.
The world wouldn't work if we were all the same, And
in the Discovery report, there's so many different placements on that wheel where people can show up, and where you might think, you're in this quadrant of a analysis tool, and it means generalization, you must be like this. Well, no, there's so many intricacies of how people show up and in different situations.
Right. And to that last point, it's not just who you are, but how you react to different situations. That was quite interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your experience, what are the top 3 qualities that successful family enterprise leaders possess?
I would say one of them is inclusion, recognizing that they don't know everything, having confidence in that, and seeking support where they need to, and being very open to different ways to think, participate, or, and recognizing that there's evolution. The system evolves. And I think lastly, it's probably, their experience is from building from the ground up, and they know everything that went on for the last 40 years or 50 years of the company's development, and not expecting that of the people coming in, because they're inheriting a much bigger beast. They haven't had to do the quotes on the back of their, truck bed. So they're coming at it at a very different space and knowledge than the people who started the business are. And that's a good thing.
Yep, absolutely. Appreciating where somebody's come from and what the situation is from both situations.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because some, and they should take great pride into the fact that, they knew every quote and they worked on every job, but that doesn't mean it was the perfect job or the perfect quote.
Right.
Right. It could at the very end of How I Built This, which is a PBS podcast. Highly recommend it for entrepreneurs. But the question is, how much of your success do you equate to luck or yourself? And I'll tell you, more of it's luck. Right place, right time, growing economies in there.
Yep.
Working hard.
Yep. Absolutely.
So there's lots of things that play into success.
Absolutely. And now, Sharon, I wanted to make sure that we've covered everything today. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience that we didn't get a chance to touch on?
The only thing I would say is that, I've had the benefit of a lens through so many different businesses, and I worked for many years out of consulting out of Deloitte's in Toronto with big organizations, and worked here in Calgary and worked in Vancouver. And doesn't matter size or scale, there's always issues. There's no perfect business. There's no perfect situation. There's always challenges, or, you coast for a little while and then you have to, shift and change. And it's its own ecosystem, a business and the relationships, that extend from that. So, it's just, there's always improvements that can be made.
Yeah.
That's why there's consultants.
Right. Yes.
So doesn't mean, size, scale, from the littlest to the biggest.
Yeah. Well, and like they say, if you've seen one business, you've seen one business. Great. Well, thank you, Sharon, for taking the time to share your expertise and experiences with us today. Your insights have been extremely beneficial and valuable. And I know that our audience will be grateful, and I'm grateful for your contribution to this episode. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
As we wrap up this episode, we invite you to reflect on the insights that Sharon has shared about valuation and planning for ownership succession in family businesses. Whether you are part of a family business or provide consulting to them, Sharon's expertise highlights the importance of proactive planning, understanding valuation drivers, and managing expectations to ensure a smooth transition and long-term success. Throughout our discussion, Sharon emphasized several key takeaways. Recognize the need to transition earlier than you might think, allowing for ample time to plan and execute. Consider the financial implications of ownership changes and potential impact on both the business and family members. Understand the valuation drivers of your business and organize accordingly, even if you're not immediately planning to sell. Finally, ensure open communication and alignment of expectations among all parties involved in the succession process. For those seeking additional guidance on business valuation relating to planning for your ownership succession, Sharon Gray at RDT Valuations Group, Inc. has extensive experience working with family enterprises. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have specific questions or concerns. We've included Sharon's contact information and additional resources in the show notes to support you on your journey. Thank you for joining me, Corey Gagnon, your host of Legacy Builders Podcast. It's my personal passion to explore with you these topics related to family wealth. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred podcast platform. And don't forget to share this episode with family, friends, and colleagues who you care about. If you'd like to help support this show, you can do so by leaving a rating and review. If you have any questions about anything shared on today's episode, or have topics you'd like us to dive deeper into in future episodes, please let us know by emailing beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com. That's beaconfamilyoffice@ASSANTE.com. Legacy Builders, Strategies for Building Successful Family Enterprises is brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante. Are you worried about losing what you've created and seeking ways to transition your wealth across generations? Beacon Family Office at Asante supports our clients transition their wealth while maintaining relationships. If you'd like to access more content we've created, you can visit us at beaconfamilyoffice.com or for more details on our services and book an initial call. Thanks again for listening, and until next episode, stay intentional about building your legacy. This program was prepared by Corey Gagnon, who is a senior wealth advisor with Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. This is not an official program of Asante Financial Management, and the statements and opinions expressed during this podcast are not necessarily those of Asante Financial Management. This show is intended for general information only and may not apply to all listeners or investors. Please obtain professional financial advice or contact us at beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com or visit beaconfamilyoffice.com to discuss your particular circumstances prior to acting on the information presented.